In 1771, a young man named Valentin Haüy, let's call him Haüy, shall we, was strolling down a Paris street when he found himself at St. Ovid's Fair and saw a raucous crowd that was jeering and cheering 10 blind men from the city's hospice for blind people. They were wearing dunce caps and asses' ears and mock playing broken cellos and violas. Stands of music faced the audience, who were banging tankards and drunkenly dancing. Haüy was horrified by the spectacle, which was dubbed the Café of the Blind. And in response, he vowed to substitute the truth for this mockery, and make the blind read. Okay, that's all the French accent I'm going to do. So seeing the spectacle prompted him to make a promise to himself. I will put in their hands volumes printed by themselves. They will trace the true characters and will read their own writing. They will also give harmonious concerts. Then, with the theatrical flourish, he addresses the cited impresario. He says, "Yes, atrocious maligner, whoever thou art, the ears of the ass with which thou wouldst degrade the head of misfortune shall be attached to thine own." Though Haüy would revise the details of the story through the years, his encounter with the Café of the Blind stuck as the flamboyant first inspiration for his eventual school for the blind, the first of its kind in the world. I was in the basement of NYU's Bobst library in its little padded, soundproofed cell that housed all kinds of cool, accessible technology that I and the other blind and visually impaired students used while secretly eating our lunch because the librarians couldn't see us in there. When I first read of Haüy at the Café of the Blind, and the vivid spectacle seemed to me at least as delightful as it was dreadful. I think I'm not alone in feeling conflicted. There's a guilty glee in the recounting of this origin story. Though it may seem to some to be exploitative, it is nevertheless seldom left out of histories of the education of the blind. As one chronicler put it, because of the ire aroused in Haüy, this carnival scene in a Paris street became the true starting point of the systematic education of the blind. This is true, of course, but what about those blind guys, those blind performers? The dunce caps and asses' ears notwithstanding, I bet they had a blast. Here's how our chronicler describes the scene. Now and again, a drunken couple rose and danced in the street to the fantastic music. The rowdies who gathered at night stormed the blind man's platform and would have demolished it in their exuberance, but for a cordon of guards called in to keep order. Sounds like a hit to me. I don't know about you, but I've never experienced quite that much enthusiasm from an audience before. I like how the Café of the Blind juxtaposes the hilarity of the burlesque blind musicians with the sobriety of Haüy's impulse to educate them, the outrageous spectacle with Enlightenment humanitarianism. Sadly, we'll never know what the blind entertainers were thinking. We have only the cited Haüy's pissed off perspective. But as so often happens to people with big, new, crazy ideas, Haüy didn't know what to do next. For 13 years, he sat on his idea to educate the blind and went about his life as an orthographer, which was basically a guy who read and wrote and deciphered lots of languages for rich people. Until one day, a young Viennese musician named Maria Teresa von Paradis came to Paris and was all the rage for the 1784 season. Although she was only 18, she already had quite a romantic history, having been involved in a treatment with the infamous Dr. Franz Anton Mesmer. Yes, the dude who gave us the word mesmerize. But after her cure, in air quotes, she couldn't play the piano or harpsichord anymore. She was apparently mesmerized by the look of her own fingers. So her parents ripped her away from Mesmer's care, kicking and screaming, apparently. It was quite a scandal, and somehow she ended up blind again. By the time she got to Paris on her European tour, that was all behind her. Now she was called the blind magician. Haha. During her performances, she would sing and play the pianoforte, and after the musical performance, she'd demonstrate her pedagogical instruments, raised maps and letters. It was a visit to one of her demonstrations that finally kicked Haüy in the butt and got him moving on his educating the blind scheme. Of course, there had been brilliant and rich blind people like John Milton and Maria Theresa von Paradis who had risen to the top of their game, but poor blind folk were basically screwed until Haüy opened up his school, which is why he's called in the history books the father and apostle of the blind. Speaking of poor blind kids, Haüy found his first victim, student, begging on the steps of a Paris church and offered to teach him how to read. But the kid, a 16-year-old with family obligations, had no interest in this learning how to read crap. He had to make some money and refused to leave his lucrative church steps until Haüy agreed to pay him for his time. I should remind you that there was no Braille yet. Louis Braille wouldn't be born for another 20 some odd years. So Haüy was teaching his first student using letters carved into wooden blocks until the student hit upon the next great innovation. The kid was feeling some fancy lettered invitation on Haüy's desk and stumbled upon an O on the back side of the letter. Aha, said Haüy, and used the wrong end of his quill to emboss more letters backwards so that they'd be embossed on the front side. Things moved swiftly. Then he opened up his school in 1785, and his students became a new kind of entertainment, an enlightened entertainment. They were all the rage. In 1786, they joined the king and queen in their winter festivities at Versailles, and the little blind kids performed Enlightenment by showing off their reading, writing, musical, and math skills. Note the bad timing. You don't have to be an historian to be familiar with the date 1789. So this was not a good time to be buddy-buddy with Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Haüy's school hardly had a moment to flourish before the French Revolution erupted and the benevolent aims of progress were nearly forgotten in all the bloodshed. With so many of its rich patrons beheaded, the Paris school fell on hard times. It would struggle on without Haüy, who found himself on the wrong side of the new regime. Years after he was ousted from the school he'd founded, a young Louis Braille would enter that school, be educated, and then invent a writing system that would eventually revolutionize blind education.
Their Plant Eyes, A Personal and Cultural History of Blindness by M. Leona Godin.